body and grinding down the
Okay, we'll start with this per tweet from Michael Benson. Frank Warren has revealed that he's booked a venue on October 22nd in London for WBO mandatory challenger Anthony Yarde to challenge the winner of Artur Beterbiev versus Joe Smith Jr. for the unified WBC, IBF, and WBO light heavyweight world titles, which comes as a surprise to no one, at least not around here, because we've known this was the plan. This was the play, not just for weeks, but for months.
This is why Anthony Yarde rejected that offer from Eddie Hearn.
This is why Anthony rejected that offer, because he knew he was in line for a title shot.
Before Joshua Buatsi versus Craig Richards was made official, weeks ago,
Eddie Hearn made an offer to Anthony Yarde to have him fight his guy, Joshua Buatsi, and that offer was rejected because Anthony knew
he's got first dibs on the winner of Joe Smith Jr. versus Artur Beterbiev.
So why gamble with Joshua Buatsi when you can gamble on the winner of that fight? Take your shot. Take your chance.
And if you needed any further indicator.
For anyone out there who might have been hoping that Dimitri Bivol would cap this year off fighting for the undisputed light heavyweight championship of the world, Bob killed that dream.
Killed that dream right after Bivol beat Canelo. You missed it?
Seen the fact that maybe faced Bivol, and did you see the Canelo performance with him and Bivol?
Well, Bivol is a good fighter, and it was a good performance, but Bivol fights on the DAZN platform, and we're not interested in having our fighters fight on DAZN, and our fighters pretty much don't want to fight on DAZN. They want to fight on ESPN, where they get the biggest audience. So my suggestion to Bivol is, if the Canelo rematch isn't available, he should fight Gilberto Ramirez, who is promoted by Golden Boy, and Golden Boy and Eddie Hearn both do their fights on DAZN.
There shouldn't be any confusion in association with this sequence of fights, because we've talked about it several times already here on this channel. It was agreed some time ago that the winner of Joe Smith Jr. versus Artur Beterbiev would move straight into an Anthony Yarde fight. And even though a Dimitri Bivol undisputed title fight for the winner of that fight could be used as a means to circumvent Yarde as a mandatory challenger, WBO's mandatory challenger,
right,
that's not what Bob wants to do. For the time being, Dimitri Bivol is a matchroom fighter, and Bob's not going to send the winner of that fight over to Matchroom and DAZN, even if that is the very best fight you can make for the winner of that fight. He'd rather keep things in-house and have the winner of that fight Anthony Yarde.
Bivol's still a matchroom fighter, and he's likely to stay a matchroom fighter until such a time as he can fight Canelo Alvarez again.
Well, I know that Dimitri Bivol himself said that he would rather fight the winner of Artur Beterbiev versus Joe Smith Jr., but you heard what Bob said. Bob's not sending the winner of that fight over to Matchroom and DAZN.
Yeah, Dimitri Bivol himself might want to fight for more belts to help unify this division, but right now he don't have access to them.
It's for this reason that Eddie Hearn has declared that he will be pushing to make Dimitri Bivol versus Joshua Buatsi for Dimitri's WBA light heavyweight world title in September or October.
Wait a minute, what about Zurdo? I thought Zurdo was the mandatory challenger.
Well, he is, but the WBA has yet to order that fight, and until such a time as they do, there's a free negotiation period for Dimitri Bivol to negotiate with anybody, Zurdo or Joshua Buatsi. I mean, we know that the Zurdo people say that they want the fight.
Zurdo's using the angle that he will exact vengeance on Bivol for beating a Mexican national hero in Canelo Alvarez. That's what he's saying.
It's a marketing strategy. An obvious marketing strategy, an obvious marketing angle, but it works. Bivol versus Zerto here in the United States. Over there in the West Coast, that does very good business, but I know of no negotiations happening between the Zerto people and the Bivol people, and what we are hearing is that Eddie wants to make a fight likely in the United Kingdom between two of his own boys, Dmitry Bivol and Joshua Buatsi. That does good business over there across the pond.
Hey, listen, Joshua Buatsi was just in a decent-sized domestic clash with Craig Richards.
With Dmitry Bivol having upset the apple cart for Canelo Alvarez, that has gotten him some momentum, and that makes a fight between him and Joshua Buatsi a bigger fight than the Craig Richards fight was.
Craig Richards is a common opponent between both boys.
Now, Buatsi versus Bivol in the UK does good business, but I maintain my original position that this is not a fight I think Joshua Buatsi is ready for. And if they get this thing over the line for either September or October, conservatively, I'm going with Dmitry Bivol to win on points.
I'm saying it. I don't think Joshua Buatsi's ready for this fight. Not right now.
Is he a world-class contender? Yes, but does he also need more experience? I'd say so. I'd say a more sensible and sensical fight for Joshua Buatsi en route to a title shot would be a Callum Smith fight.
But if they want to jump off the deep end, by all means, go ahead. I'll watch.
Don't confuse my anecdotes and annotations with complaints. If they make that fight, I'll watch that fight. I'm just saying that I don't think it's a fight that Joshua Buatsi, here now, I don't think it's a fight that he's ready for. And when it comes to Anthony Yarde, potentially facing the winner of Beterbiev versus Smith later on this year in the fall.
Listen, that's a great fight.
Every single one of those three guys, they're punchers. Joe Smith Jr. is a puncher, Artur Beterbiev's a puncher, and so is Anthony Yarde.
Anthony hasn't seen action since December of last year when he avenged the loss to Lyndon Arthur.
Based on this news, that Frank Warren has booked a venue for October 22nd for Anthony Yarde's fight with the winner of that fight.
What's that, 10 months?
Anthony Yarde will not have seen action in approximately 10 months. He will have not seen action since December of last year to October later on this year. In that way, he will have been out of action for roughly 10 months. And that's not the longest stint of inactivity, but you would have thought that Frank would have been able to get him out there one more time, at least one more time, before such a big fight.
Such an important fight. In many ways, it's the most important fight of Anthony Yarde's career to date.
You know, he turned down the Eddie Hearn offer to fight Joshua Buatsi earlier this year, and I understood it, but I understood it with the understanding, or at least the feeling, that maybe Frank would negotiate something internally. You know, a little keep busy fight, a little tune-up fight for Anthony Yarde to keep the tools sharp, and it seems like this might be his only fight this year.
That's a schedule. Make of that what you will.
In welterweight news, former champion Ishe Smith stated, hearing from some very reliable sources, that Crawford versus Spence is done. Problem is, Canelo jumped on the September date they wanted against Triple G. Date unknown currently.
A lot of people are taking issue with that comment that Canelo jumped on that date.
One, because that's when people expect to see a Canelo Alvarez fight. I believe that's a Mexican holiday. And two, Canelo versus Golovkin 3 has already been announced, whereas Crawford versus Spence,
That hasn't been officially announced, so they more or less beat you to the punch.
that's the look of it. In a calendar year, you expect to see Canelo Alvarez in May and September. Robert Little, BSO, stated, Errol Spence Jr. implied a contract has been sent to Bud Crawford, and he's waiting for him to sign for their long-awaited welterweight undisputed fight.
All signs are good.
Multiple sources all stating the same thing, from Ishe Smith to Robert Little to Showtime executive Stefan Espinoza, who very recently stated the fight is 2/3 done.
They just need to get the deal right.
So according to some sources, depending on who you ask, the deal is already done, and what they're working on now is working on the date, because they don't want to have to go head-to-head with Canelo Alvarez.
And that's understandable.
You gotta work it out. Ishe Smith states, I trust my sources, and the date complaint is valid. Canelo needs to jump off September. Crawford versus Spence is a bigger fight.
No, it's not.
These sentiments from Ishe Smith have given rise to widespread debates as to which fight is in fact the bigger fight. A Canelo versus Golovkin trilogy, or the long-awaited, long-anticipated Errol Spence Jr. versus Terence Crawford showdown. In truth, both of those fights are going to get my money when the time comes.
So there's no need to belittle or berate one fight for the
So
other.
if we are to address this talking point as to which fight is the bigger fight and which fight needs to be move off of September to perhaps a later date, I'd have to say that Crawford versus Spence, they're the ones that got to move off of September, because that's Canelo Alvarez's time to shine. That's when a large portion of the boxing community expects to see him fight, and it being that The Canelo versus Golovkin trilogy has already been announced, whereas Crawford...
Spence versus Crawford is still being worked out.
It's not Canelo Alvarez and Gennady Golovkin that need to move off of that September date. It really is Crawford and Spence. Now, if they want to, they can go head-to-head.
It's your funeral.
I guarantee you. I can fucking guarantee you. Canelo Alvarez versus Gennady Golovkin 3 will bring in more pay-per-view buys than the Spence versus Crawford fight.
It's just the truth. It's reality.
You know, Canelo Alvarez fought on the same premium cable network as Errol Spence Jr., and there's a rather large disparity between what Canelo brought in with his fight and what Errol Spence Jr. brought in with his fight. Canelo's fight with Caleb Plant did approximately 800,000 pay-per-view buys, whereas Spence versus Ugas, what did that do? A little over 200,000?
Bear in mind that Ugas was coming off the biggest win of his career. He just shared the ring with Manny Pacquiao.
But the buy rate for Ugas versus Pacquiao was somewhat abysmal, as was the buy rate for Spence versus Ugas. There's not much of a difference between the reported buys for both of those fights, whereas Canelo Alvarez sold almost 4 times as much as they did with their fight. Approximately 800,000 pay-per-view buys reported for the Caleb Plant fight. And Caleb Plant is an even lesser-known guy than Ugas was because Ugas shared the ring with Manny Pacquiao.
Listen, that's basically saying that off his name alone, Canelo Alvarez was able to move 800,000 pay-per-view buys on Showtime.
He was able to move another 600,000 by way of 2 different pay-per-view distributors for his last fight, the Dmitry Bivol fight, with a little-known Russian that most Americans aren't even familiar with. And even the buys for that fight are better than Errol Spence Jr. and Terrence Crawford's best pay-per-view buys. I mean, it's really not even close. So if you guys want to go head-to-head with Canelo Alvarez, do so at your peril.
It's your funeral.
It's not Canelo Alvarez that needs to move off of that September date. It's Spence and Crawford. You know, Mark Ortega, resident PBC show.
He says Spence versus Crawford will do more U.S. pay-per-view buys than Canelo versus Triple G3.
What is that assertion based on? How many times he dreamt about licking Al Heyman's boot?
Probably.
Listen, I've been waiting for that Spence versus Crawford fight just as long, if not longer, than you guys. But the metrics are what the metrics are. And if history is any indicator of things to come, for some time now, Errol Spence Jr.'s buy rate has hovered around just about 200,000 buys. Terrence Crawford in his last fight with Sean Porter, that pay-per-view by way of ESPN, he put up 130,000. So when you think about that buy rate, you put it together, both of those boys' buy rates, and then you factor in the synergy they create with each other, which could account for as much as 150 additional pay-per-view buys. I put the buy rate domestically here in the United States for Spence versus Crawford at around 400 to 500,000 buys.
Yeah.
And that's being generous.
Yeah.
Canelo did more than that with Caleb Plant. He did more than that with Dmitry Bivol.
The metrics don't tell the story that Mark Ortega is telling.
Now, granted, it takes 2 guys to make a super fight, and Spence and Crawford together could probably sell more pay-per-views than they ever could apart, because Errol Spence Jr.'s fights and the buy rates for those fights, they hover just north of 200,000 buys. Terrence Crawford, he did 130 in his last fight. So if you put them together, they can do better than just that.
Canelo Alvarez doesn't need a high-profile dance partner to sell north of 500,000 pay-per-view buys.
I mean, he really doesn't. You just saw that. You saw that in the Caleb Plant fight. You saw that in the Dmitry Bivol fight. If you want to be in denial about it, be in denial. Just don't expect me to play along.
These guys really act like Gennady Golovkin doesn't bring marquee value of his own to the table.
If you can do north of 600,000 pay-per-view buys with a little-known Russian and Dmitry Bivol, what could you do with Gennady Golovkin the third time out? What could you do when Gennady Golovkin isn't just a big name in America, he's also a big name in Asia. He just had a super fight there.
I'm just being honest with you. Maybe you're more excited for Crawford versus Spence.
Maybe at the individual level, one fight is more to your fancy because you've already seen the other one 2 times before. But the night of the fight, when those buys come in, believe you me, Canelo versus Golovkin blows anything else happening at or around that time out of the water. And tack on that Canelo Alvarez just lost his last fight. And a lot of people are going to be curious to see what kind of headspace he's in. Can he bounce back? Or is this the out that Gennady Golovkin has needed all this time to finally secure the W over his long-time rival?
Canelo by himself commands a larger audience than both Terrence Crawford and Errol Spence put together.
Every quantifiable metric that you can think of, Canelo Alvarez by himself is bigger than both Terence Crawford and Errol Spence put together. Adding Gennady to the equation is what really puts it over the top.
Like I said, maybe at the individual level, you're more excited for one fight than the other.
Yeah, maybe you are, but you're in the minority because the majority of fight fans that pay to see fights and pay to see boxing, they pay for Canelo, tack on Gennady, and that's all she wrote.
Put these two boys in the ring for the third time?
The biggest fight you can hope to make in the United States, bar none.
Nothing comes close.
DAZN has had time to fine-tune and refine their efforts. They've had their trial run on pay-per-view here in America with the Canelo versus Bivol fight. I expect a noticeably larger promotional push for this fight because, well, they've got a lot riding on this fight and they've wanted to get it over the line for some years now. Don't forget, Canelo Alvarez got that initial deal that he got with DAZN and Gennady on the premise that there would be a third fight. Now, that third fight is here.
And that's not saying I'm not expecting a large promotional push from Showtime.
Or Fox, or whoever it is that ends up staging Crawford versus Spence, whoever foots the bill for that fight, whatever PBC-affiliated network does that. I'm expecting a large promotional push when it comes to that fight, but I'm also expecting one when it comes to this fight. And like I said, this fight promises to yield more pay-per-view buys than the other, though this is a happy problem.
This is a good problem to have for a boxing fan.
Not to be confused with a Hamanite. You see, it's the Hamanites that are caught between narratives. It's the Hamanites that used to say Terence Crawford can't sell out a high school auditorium.
Coincidentally, it's the Hamanites that are now saying that Crawford versus Spence is bigger than Canelo versus Golovkin.
Likely because it's the PBC staging that fight, and we all know they are loyal to all things PBC, but they're caught between narratives because it can't be reconciled. How could a guy that you guys were saying can't sell out a high school auditorium be part of a bigger fight than a Canelo fight?
They used to belittle and berate Terence Crawford all the time when he was over there at Top Rank.
I haven't soon forgotten because it wasn't that long ago. They used to belittle and berate that guy in favor of Errol Spence Jr. And now that he's not over there and this fight is likely going to be staged by the PBC, well, now they want to change their tune.
Well, you're off key because what you're saying don't make sense.
Singing off key and your voice is cracking because you were just belittling and berating this guy, saying that he has no marquee value. Well, if he has no marquee value, how can Errol Spence Jr. hope to outsell Canelo versus Golovkin fighting him?
You can never make sense of any of the stuff these guys say.
And in truth, you really don't have to, because I reiterate, this is a happy problem for a boxing fan. Being on the eve of Spence versus Crawford and Canelo versus Golovkin, the trilogy.
I'd say that's a good problem for a boxing fan to have, if you're a boxing fan.
Issues with working dates aside that I'm sure will be reconciled, will be resolved. We got a lot to look forward to here stateside.
Though to whom it may concern, yes, Canelo versus Golovkin is the bigger fight.
In terms of size, scale, finance.
By every quantifiable metric that makes a big fight a big fight.
For what it's worth, yeah, it is the bigger fight.